The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or good morning, wherever you may be in the world. This is Tom Norman. I want to welcome you to this month's past virtualization virtual chapter meeting. We have Luke Campbell with us today out of the Nashville area. He's going to be talking to us about PowerShell and basically how to do builds and doing desired state configuration. Of course, this will work no matter whether it's bare metal, cloud, and or a virtual environment. So I'm going to let him take it away, and I will be on mute. I forgot to tell you, Luke. So if you need something, just kind of yell at me and I'll get off mute. So.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. Thanks a lot, John, for the invite and let me speak today to the group. So this session is one that I recently did at SQL Saturday in Nashville. It just basically being familiar with PowerShell. Well, actually is required going through these slides. A lot of it may look familiar to you if you're already working with PowerShell. So we're basically to walk through the. We'll basically walk through the slides, and then about 15 minutes in or so, we'll do a demo, and that demo will consist of 2 Windows Server 2016 machines that have nothing on them except for Windows. We'll go through the installation of SQL Server 2017 and configuration. Configuration will include a couple things like SQL audit, setting up a DBA database that contains several maintenance procedures, and Ola Hallegren's set of maintenance stored procedures that we commonly use. So I'll go ahead and get started. A little bit about myself: SQL Server DBA since 2007. Before that, I was a systems administrator, mainly working on the Windows platform. Certified solutions expert, data management, analytics, and data platform. No blog just yet, but Twitter. I usually follow along on Twitter at Luke76211. The agenda, we kind of covered that, but a high-level overview of PowerShell DSC. Learn how to use PowerShell DSC for new SQL Server installations, and then we'll go through the demo. So if you're not familiar with desired state configuration, it's basically configuration as code. You'll define what you want to happen, and then basically you'll push the configuration out to your target host, and then the local configuration manager on each of those hosts will take that configuration and start running with it. So it is a declarative platform used configuration, deployment, and management of systems. Initially released with PowerShell 4.0 way back in October 2013. And then there are 2 modes, push and pull. Today we'll be demoing the actual push demo. Pull is so you can set it up, basically have a machine on the network. Once the new machines come up, and if they're configured correctly, they will actually go and reach out to that configuration manager and say, hey, what is my configuration? I'm ready to get going, and then it could pull that down. That's a little bit more in depth that I haven't got to yet, but the push seems to work really well for our purposes. So just some key concepts: configurations, declarative PowerShell scripts which define and configure instances of resources. You'll notice that the term resources is used a lot throughout this slide. So basically they make it so they are what tells the local configuration manager what to do. They can contain the code that put and keep the target of a configuration and the specified state. So the local configuration manager, it's installed by default on Windows, the newer Windows Server platforms. I've used it on 2012 and 2016. I haven't tested on 2008 or R2, but if you install WMF, Windows Management Framework 5 or above, then I would assume that it would work just fine on that platform as well. It can also monitor configuration for drift. So if by default it will just basically state, hey, something has changed, but you can make this the configuration manager to where if it does see a difference in the configuration that was pushed to it versus how it's configured now, it will automatically revert back to the way it's supposed to be configured. That's not something that I have turned on in our environment. It's just it will, you can query it to let you know that something has changed. It's drifted away from your configuration. Management object format. This is the format of the configuration files that are generated. You'll see that in just a moment in the demo, but these files are actually pushed out to the targets, and then the local configuration manager uses that file to actually run through the configuration and do what it needs to do. It's a declared language which can be created with any text editor. I wouldn't recommend it, but you can do it. It's free text, but it's something that PowerShell DSC can consume. There is, if you're familiar with PowerShell functions, you'll notice that some of these, when you're building these configurations, it's very similar to creating a function in PowerShell. One of the main differences is this keyword configuration. So how does it work? It's basically there's a few phases in which to get this going. Authoring phase, output of MOF files. So that's where you create your configuration. You run it against a set of targets, and it creates a MOF file for each of those targets. So in our example, we have two servers, server 1 and server 2. There will be a MOF file for each one of those servers, and those are what gets pushed out to the local configuration manager on each of those. So there's a staging phase. Basically, in the pool model, data and custom providers are kept on the staging server and retrieved by the target whenever they come up to get their configuration. Data is pushed from this location in the push model. So there's a few things that we'll push out. We'll push out resources. So the SQL Server resource, X SQL Server, and X computer management. So those resources can all be found on GitHub. You can pull those down and make those basically part of your configuration. And then, of course, to make it so, once you push it out, the actual local configuration manager will start up and start applying that. This slide was actually pulled down from Microsoft, and there's a link to a lot more information that goes along with that. So PowerShell DSC for SQL 2017, it's not just for 2017. I've used it for 2016 as well. Works well with 2017, but there are a little bit of differences between the 2016 install and the 2017 install. For instance, with 2016, I was actually installing reporting services in one configuration, just because that was all part of the SQL setup exe in 2016 and below. 2017, there were some changes where SSRS is actually a different install, so just be aware of some of those changes between the installations. So my goal for this was to set up a scalable framework that our team could use for installing SQL Server, installing it in a repetitive way that include all of our best practices that we've came together as a team and said, hey, we want every server that we build to look like this. Of course, there may be some deviations depending on the purpose of that server, but this is the base configuration that we want to see everywhere. It's repeatable, so there's less mistakes that you can make when you're setting up a server. For instance, if you change the error log rotation or something on one server, but you forget it, I would always forget to at least do that part, and then a couple months later I would go and see that the error logs weren't rotating like they should. So this is all built into the configuration now, so that we don't have to do that or manually configure that. So we're going to jump into the demo, but before I do that, John, probably go ahead and take a few questions if we can. Looks like we're a little bit ahead of time.
There's no questions in yet, so go right ahead.
Okay. All right. So this will we'll go through the demo of installing SQL Server 2017 on 2 machines. So the requirements: Windows Management Framework 5.0 or above. That is already installed on those images. You'll need the SQL Server ISO on a file share that is accessible by the target nodes. So what's going to happen is those nodes are going to reach out and pull that ISO and copy it locally to each of those nodes. Computer accounts, that this part is configurable, so you can configure these configurations to run under a specific account. I've just left it as the computer account, and I've granted access on this file share to the computer account just to make things a little easier, but they'll need read access. DSC Resources, these are the resources you can go and pull down on from GitHub, and I've got links to all of this at the end of the slide. But SQL Server, we're using that resource, X Computer Management, X SQL Server, and there's several resources that are already built into the OS that we're using, like a file resource and a few others that we'll get to in the scripts. So the setup, I have one server acting as a configuration server. Nothing really special about that server. It's just got the share on it and all of the resources that I'm going to be pushing out. There's no special tools or anything outside of the OS there. I am using Windows Server 2016, works just as well on 2012 R2. Firewall consideration, so if you're in a secured environment between, and you've got a firewall between your configuration server and your SQL servers, there are some TCP ports that need to be open to allow this communication. A full list of those can be found in this link. So the targets are Windows Server 2016, and WMF, of course, is already installed, and they're joined to basically a domain lab.net. I'll talk about these before as we talk about these, I'll go ahead and pull the scripts up. But my server data.psd1 is basically my customized configuration data file used with each of the following scripts. So they basically contain the configuration parameters specific to each target node. So if I want SQL Server to run as a different account for each one of these, which we do, I'll specify that account there. We're using group managed service account, so there's no need to keep a password in there or anything like that. But you can do that. You can put the password. There's just some caution there. If you put a password in the PSD1 file, it is plain text. Once you do your configuration, it would be best practice to go back and remove that password from that file. We also set up the ports that each SQL server is going to run on, just to show the flexibility of this of these parameters. And you can do a lot of other things. So DSC modules PS1, that's our first configuration that we're going to push out. All it does is goes in those resources that we talked about, X SQL Server, and X Computer Management. Since those aren't on each target by default, we're going to push those out first, because the SQL install 2017 configuration will actually look for those and need those before it can start. So before I discuss this one, I want to go ahead and jump over here and we'll take a look at the first two scripts. So this is the configuration server. Basically, I've got my server data.psd1 pulled up. Installed media is my share, and that's where I'm storing. That's where I am. No, actually, my share is this one. So as you'll see, we've got SQL. Let's see. SQL 2017, and we're going to push out the ISO and also the latest at the time I built the demo, the CEU. So we're going to install SQL Server, and then we're also going to apply that CEU. And then so basically your configuration, your data configuration file doesn't have to be separate from your actual configurations, but I like to keep that separate in case I want to. It's much easier to go in here and change this and then just consume this file by the configuration script. That's just a personal preference. I like to keep it separate. So basically, it's going to. This is JSON, so we're going to, node name is the SQL Server 01 role. So there can be multiple rows here. So if you had a configuration file for a specific application, and for example, that application had multiple web servers and database servers and file servers, you could potentially have all of those configurations in this one data file, and you can specify what role that machine is going to be. Whether it's going to be a web server, then this configuration would apply to it. If it's a SQL box, then in this configuration would be used. So you'll see that we're filtering on this role name in our actual configuration files. So just to walk through this, you've got a couple of parameters in here, variables that we're going to be using. Configuration, so that's our INI file that we're going to be using. SQL Server service account, agent service account, SA password. So that's something that you could go back and, of course, remove in this file after you've done the deployment. Catalog. We're also going to set up integration services catalog. That's the password for that. Our audit, SQL audit folder. That's where of course, the audits are going to be stored until we consume those into a database. And then the TCP port that we want SQL Server to run on. So in this case, 7200 and 7203 for Server 02. If we take a quick look at DSC modules, you'll see the keyword configuration. So if you're familiar with the PowerShell functions, looks very familiar to that. It's just this is the keyword configuration DSC modules. We're going to pass in a couple of parameters. Package path, basically that's the share of where those resources are stored. We're going to import this DSC resource, PS Desired State Configuration, and then we're going to iterate over our data file. Basically, this is the configuration data file that we're going to pass in at myserverdata.psd1. And as it iterates over that, it's going to create those MOF files. So we're going to call each one of these is a resource. So this is the DSC resource, and you have to provide a unique name for that resource. So you can call log multiple times in here and have it do different things, but each time you have it specified here, you have to give it a unique name. So message, basically this is just going to make an entry into the DSC event log that we're starting this. This is another resource that we're using, file, and then we're giving it a unique name, copy DSC modules. What we're doing is we want to ensure that these resources have been copied and exist in this local path on each of our targets. So we're recurse, we're going to, everything that's in this modules directory, we're going to make sure that it exists on our targets. And then after this configuration is created, we're actually going to call that configuration in this script. We're going to pass in that myserverdata.psd1 that we just looked at. I failed to mention this, but this is where we're filtering over on that role. So that could be web server or anything like that, to specify that you only want this configuration to apply to the web server nodes in that data file. Here is our package path variable. Lab DC is our current machine that we're on, and then install media is the location of our modules or resources that we're pushing out. just verbose so I can see what's going on. So whenever I run this, what's going to happen? Oh, let me get back to the right directory here. So what's going to happen is there's going to be one folder created. The folder is going to be DSC modules, and it's going to create 2 MOF files. We'll take a quick look at those. So there you see that it created SQL SVR 01 and 02. And it created this folder here, DSC modules. And if we go here and open one of these up, they are human readable, but it's something really built for the local configuration manager to consume. So a little bit information on who created it, where it was created, the date, and the host. So, and this is the actual configuration that's consumed by the LCM. I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but if the demo files will be out there. So it's basically source info, recurse is true. A lot of the same information that you saw in the configuration. It's just in a format for the LCM. So at that point, we've created our MOF files, but we really haven't pushed that configuration out to our targets. So the next thing that we're going to do is basically we've got to start the DSC configuration. We've got to give it a path to those MOF files that we just created. And then we're going to add weight. So adding weight is basically so that we can follow along of what's happening on each of those machines. If you don't add weight, then it's basically going to push those out. The local configuration manager on each of those targets are going to work. And of course, everything's independent of each other. But you just won't get any feedback, which is usually fine. If you've got multiple machines, you actually just want to push this out to, and then you could automate a way to go and check the logs, the DSC logs at a later time to see how it did. But for the purposes of the demo, I'm going to add weight so that we get that feedback from each of those. And then we're going to go ahead and do a verbose as well. So what this is going to do, it's going to push those MOF files out to each of those targets, and then it's going to, the local configuration manager is going to start doing the work. The work here is coming and grabbing those additional resources and placing them on the machine. So that usually takes probably around 20 to 30 seconds to push those out. I don't know, do we have any questions so far?
Nope, no questions.
Okay, great. I did want to show these other machines just to show that, hey, there's nothing installed on them. This is server 01 and server 02. All right, so we've pushed out those resources that we're going to need. Let's talk about the actual SQL install configuration. So it's going to do the same thing. It's going to create 2 MOF files in a SQL install 2017 folder. And some of the things it's going to do is, once we start it, is going to copy the SQL Server ISO and the configuration INI files to all target nodes. It's going to configure the OS power plan to high performance. It's going to copy a SQL Server.SQL management scripts to each target node. So you'll notice each one of those scripts, it basically has a get script, a set script, and a test script. You'll see it called in this in the actual configuration, but each of those, what DSC is going to do, it's going to basically run one of those scripts to check to see if it's already in that configured state that we're asking it to be in. If not, then we want that to throw an error. Basically, DSC is looking for an error to come back if we're not in the configured state. And then what's going to happen is going to actually run the set script. So for instance, we're installing several scripts that Ola Hallegren has come up with for index maintenance, DBCC, check DB, a lot of other things that we want to ensure that's on each of our machines. And if those don't exist, then it's going to call the set script to go out and build those in a database called DBA. You'll also see that for jobs, SQL Server jobs. We have several jobs that we want to do index maintenance and everything, and it just pushes those out. Of course, at a later time, you can go and change the schedule around and everything for each of those. But that you'll see those. It takes some getting used to. There's a ton of information out on GitHub how to use that. Basically, the X SQL Server resource is being used to push those SQL scripts out, or actually run through those SQL scripts. All right, so that's the end of our slides. We'll go ahead and walk through this script. So you'll see that configuration here again, SQL install. We're passing in package path. Win resources is not used for this demo, but when you're running on I believe it was 2012 .NET 3.5 wasn't installed by default. So that's something that we were doing by this configuration script. I just left it in here, and then the audit file path. That's for the SQL audits. But now that's even moved to the PSD1 file. So we're going to import those resources. This is where it's very important to run this DSC modules first, because this will fail if those modules don't exist there. PS desired state configuration, that's just the default. X computer management. X computer management is the resource that we're going to utilize for setting the power plan to high performance. And then X SQL Server, you'll see it called several times. Same thing here, we're going to node, then all nodes that where the content, we're looking for the SQL engine role. Car log, and then X power plan is the resource that we're going to call to set the high performance power plan. This is commented out. That's where we were doing the .NET 3.5 install. So several times we call the file resource. You'll notice that we give it a unique name each time. If you don't give it a unique name, the compilation of the MOF files will fail. So here's where we're going to copy the SQL Server ISO to each one of those targets, the CU3 to each one of those. Basically the INI file, we're going to copy all of our management DB scripts. All of these are going to ctemp on each of those. Of course, that's configurable if you have another place to put it. And then the audit file path. I think that's it for file. And then here is where we're calling a script resource. This script was based on a script that I pulled from this website, which he did a really good job on putting this together. There is an easier way to do this by using the X SQL Server resource to do the installation, but this I preferred this method because it made it a lot more flexible from what I saw whenever I first looked at the actual resource. So I just stuck with this. I may change it at some point, but right now it does a good job of what we needed to do. So you'll notice that this script resource does a get, does a set, and it also does a test. This portion of the script, I'm not very familiar on what it's used for. So get and test to me are kind of synonymous in this case, but there's more in the resources. You can go out and look at the different purposes for each of these. So basically what we're going to do with this get script, we're going to call WMI, and we're going to look to see if there's a service running MS SQL. If not, it's also going to test. It's basically the same, looks to be the same thing. So if it's not installed, it's going to give us an error, and it's going to say not installed, and then at that point it's going to go and run this. So this is actually doing the installation. We're going to mount that ISO that's in ctemp. We're going to pass it the configuration file. This is our INI. So you'll notice that this configuration parameter maps back to this guy here in your data file. So as we build those MOF files, it will actually pull in the data from this PSD1 file and replace those variables with this value. Do that several times for the service account, agent service account, SA password, and then of course if there's an error that it can't mount that ISO, we want to go ahead and throw an error. And then this is our actual command. It's just setup.exe, and this is very similar to what you would do if you were just installing SQL Server from the command line. Once we're finished, we're going to dismount that ISO, and then we're going to continue on. So this is something I definitely wanted to mention, is this depends on. So it's very important to have this in here, because my understanding is local configuration manager would not necessarily do this in any order unless it has this. So it could do multiple configurations out of order unless you have depends on. So what I want to make sure happens is these operations complete. So I want to make sure that the file SQL Server CU3 has been copied and the ISO has been copied before this starts. Once that's done, now we're going to configure several different options in SQL Server. Of course, server memory. We're going to set the max server memory. It's calculated. We're using dynamic allocation. I forget exactly how this is being calculated, but it leaves a certain percentage available to the OS. You can also set this if you just wanted to hard code it, but our machines, of course, we didn't want to hard code it because it could be different memory available on each of those nodes. Here again, depends on. We want to make sure that the installation has actually occurred before we start trying to do this. Max stop, we want to set that to 4 on most of our machines. And then we want to enable CLR because the integration services catalog is being installed and requires CLR to be enabled. Cost threshold for parallelism, we usually start out with 20, and then we can adjust that as we go. Here is where we're going to create our DBA database. So you'll notice each one of these is a different resource. SQL Server configuration. These two are the same, but max stop. So there are a ton of resources inside, or ton of modules inside the SQL Server resource that you can utilize. We also like to have who is active on most of our machines. If you're not familiar with that one, Adam Mechanic created that several years ago and has been I mean, it's hard to go to a machine that doesn't have that and run SP-Who2. You just don't get the amount of information that SP-Who is active gives you. So once that is done, we're going to go ahead and deploy our DBA objects. So that's where we're deploying Ola Halloran scripts and a couple of our other ones to handle permissions and things like that to that DBA database. Of course, we want to make sure that it's been created. So here you'll notice kind of the same thing that we're doing with the install script above. We're doing it here: set, get, and test. And this will fail if you don't have all three. Here we're calling that resource again, but we're going to make sure that we have the standard operators on that machine. Maintenance jobs, we call this one several times SQL Server script. Here's where we're setting up our standard audits, and then the number of error logs we like to see. We're going to rotate those every 24 hours, and we want to host up to 30. So 30 days of error logs. Also disable SQL Server authentication. And then we're going to jump back and install integration services catalog. We call the script resource again. And we go through and set up the catalog. if it's already there, then we're not going to do anything. Next, we're going to change the port that SQL Server is listing on, depending on what's here, TCP port. That's what we're going to set it to. And then we're also going to rename SA to something not SA. And then we're also going to set the database owner of DBA. So this is what we're going to set SA as. And once that configuration is built, we're basically going to run it, and it's going to create that folder with 2 moth files containing this configuration. So we'll go ahead and run that. Notice it install or set up this folder, and then I won't run through this, but as you can see, it built the configuration of everything that we want to do, and it grabbed our parameters out of the data file. And we're going to go ahead and start. So this usually takes probably around 5 minutes or so. It'd be a good time if there's any questions.
Still no questions in the queue.
Okay.
Oh, here's some. Okay, I do have some for you here. Can this be used with earlier versions of SQL Server below 2016?
Yes. So PowerShell DSC really isn't dependent, or SQL Server isn't really dependent on DSC. As long as you can provide the parameters. If you were doing this at the command line with SQL Server 2008, as long as you can provide those set of parameters for the installation, then you could do it with DSC.
Okay. And let's see. And others is just asking about, is it going to be recorded? Yes, we are recording it. And yes, I'll get the slides from Luke so that we can post it up on the website. Okay, we got some more here. Just kind of going through them here, man, asking about recording and stuff. Is there any requirements for PowerShell to use DSC?
Just the Windows Management Framework. I've usually went with 5 or above. So that would be, I know there were a lot of updates in Management Framework 5 for DSC, makes it a little easier to work with. It may work with older versions. I'm just not familiar with how or if there's any differences.
Okay, will your scripts work with named instances or just with the default instance?
The current scripts will only work with default instances. There's no, there's no concern about if you want to do a named instance, you would just have to, of course, make some modifications to make it do that.
Okay.
But the default, the scripts as is will only do the install for the default instance.
And then someone asked, can we use a file share location for install files as opposed to copying the files over to each server?
Yes. The only concern that I had on that, let's say I was building 6 machines, I wanted to just make sure that middle way through the install, if the network went down or anything like that, that I wouldn't, it wouldn't affect my installation. But yeah, you could absolutely do that.
And then can you use parameters to apply a specific named instance?
I would, that's almost certainly, yes, you could. You could parameterize your scripts to do that.
Okay. We're doing exactly this in production environment, automation of SQL Server installs right now, but we have our VM admin pushing it out. I'm in the middle of the upgrade, so I can't fully focus on this. Do you have any scripts posted? So yes, we'll get them posted. And you mentioned that it's in GitHub, right, where they can download the code?
Well, they can download most of the resources that I'm utilizing, but the scripts that I put together are not in GitHub. I do have them out on the SQL Saturday for Nashville this past January.
Okay.
But if you have somewhere I can upload, I'd be more than happy to put those in the slides there.
Yeah, if you can put them in with the slides, I can definitely upload, and then when I post it, then people can go get them.
Okay.
Can this be used to install SQL failover cluster instances for 2 or more nodes?
It can. You can also do always on. It's just, it is very flexible on what you can do. You can actually install of course, the cluster, set up failover clusters. You can go through all the way availability groups. There's a lot that I haven't done with it yet that we're still working on, but from what I've saw so far, it is extremely flexible.
And just to comment on that, on the SQL failover cluster instance, Ryan Adams did a presentation in SQL Saturday Houston last year that I saw, and he was doing it with scripts and stuff. So there would be a resource for you. Can you install Power BI SSRS for SQL Server with DSC?
I am not sure. I haven't done that. I wouldn't see a reason that you couldn't. SSRS 2017 is something that I'm planning to put some scripts together for. I just haven't jumped into that. But I'm not going to say you can because I haven't done it. But I would assume that you could. I don't see any limitation around that.
There is just as we're waiting for this to be done, unless it's already done for you. There's a SQL Slack channel called SQL Community, and in there the PowerShell people have some information up there too. So there's a whole group of people by Aaron Nelson and Christy Lamar that have tons and tons and tons of PowerShell scripts already written for a lot of SQL Server.
Great. Now the GitHub gallery, I think it's just the PowerShell gallery. I've got it here in resources. But you hit this, there's a lot of documentation out there that takes you through a lot of different examples and everything you can do with DSC. But the Slack channel is something I definitely would like to take a look at.
Yeah, it's that Slack channel, SQL Community. The only bad part about it is there's no history, so it only goes back as far as the free version of it. But there's not only the PowerShell channel, but there is like just boatloads of different channels and stuff that you can go out there on that you can ask people. It's almost like Pound SQL Help, Twitter and stuff.
Yep.
But now it's I think people started up in Slack to basically, we used to have and still do somewhat, the limitation of how long a question could be, of course, in Twitter. So people went over to Slack. So if you haven't been over there, it's just called SQL Community. I'm pretty sure that's what that is. I'll verify it while we're talking. I'll just go over there and make sure. I'm pulling it up here. And if you've got things to continue on, that's fine as I get it to come up here.
This should be getting close. I hear my fan ramping up. So
all right.
Usually there it goes. It's so now it's did the install. It's going through all the configuration. Installing SPU is active. Setting max memory. This part usually goes by pretty quick.
And then I'm going to go ahead and I'll put it out there. It is SQL Community .slack.com. If you haven't done, and Slack is free, so anybody can go to this particular channel. And as I said, it's got more stuff than you could ever dream of. PowerShell help, SQL Saturday, SSDT, SSIS, SSRS. It's just from some of them, Azure. There's a lot of them, a lot of channels. So
very cool. I'll have to check that out. So this has completed. So if we should be able to go out here and just refresh. Now we see that we have SQL installed, both machines. And then I do want to just show you the port, and then we'll jump into SQL. So you can see this one's running on 7203, the other one's running on 7200. So if we go back to our configuration machine, I have Management Studio installed. Now, Management Studio is not part of this demo, but you can install it using DSC as well. Management Studio, I've installed 17.4 with it. You basically call a package resource. You can push it out and do the same thing, run through the install. But I actually removed that because it took longer to install than SQL did. So if we go here, we can connect to those machines. See, we're running with that CU3. And then if we could take a look at databases, we have our catalog, and then we have our DBA database. Open that guy up. We can go in and see the tables and program stored procedures. Same thing on this machine. SQL Server agent, you'll see that we have some standard jobs that we've also deployed. Take a look at max memory and maxed up. So these machines have 8 gigs, 5 gigs can be consumed. Cost threshold is 20, and then max stop is, of course, 4. And I think the last thing is the SQL audit. We can see that has been set up as well. And I did, since we have a few minutes, I did want to show what happens if it gets out of state. So if I go in and on one of these machines and I remove this database. So that one's going. If I go back to the configuration and I start that back up, what's going to happen is the local configuration manager is going to run back through those that configuration that we've already deployed. It's going to come to the basically it's going to look for that DBA database and then it's going to re-add it. So it's not going to do anything else because everything else is left in the state that it should be in. So we'll let it run through. It shouldn't take maybe a second. So let's go back, do a refresh, and it should be back. So you see it puts it right back. And I believe that is the end of the demo.
okay, we appreciate you doing that. And someone did post up on there. It's pound DBA tools or PowerShell help is another way to get into PowerShell. If you're new to it, of course, PowerShell is very, very powerful. It can do just about anything you want it to do, just as long as you have the permissions to do it. That's the one caveat. But anyway, thanks, Luke, for showing us a way to basically standardize our installations. That always helps for the boxes to always be the same. So we're not ending up with issues that we're trying to figure out once something goes all the way to production.
Absolutely, and I thank you for the opportunity.
All right, and if you, I don't see more questions, just a bunch of thank yous and stuff, and look forward to probably over this weekend, I will get your presentation posted up to YouTube. And then also on the SQL Server website, when I actually send out the information, I will post his PowerPoint presentation and, of course, the video to the YouTube, and then also any scripts that he might pass along. So thanks again, and you guys have a wonderful day.
Thanks. Same to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.